sit back. JustProfessor here. You have a story about who you are, why you act the way you do, why your life turned out this way. It all makes perfect sense. Every event connects to the next. Every struggle led to growth. Every failure taught you something, except none of it is true. You made it all up. Your brain took random disconnected events and turned them into a neat story that feels meaningful but is mostly fiction. This is narrative bias, and it's completely distorting your understanding of yourself, your past, and your future. Your brain is obsessed with stories. It can't handle randomness or chaos or meaningless events, so it creates narratives to explain everything, even when there's nothing to explain. And once you have that narrative, you start living according to it, making decisions based on a story that was never real to begin with. So, what is narrative bias? It's your brain's tendency to turn everything into a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, with causes and effects, with heroes and villains, with lessons learned and character growth. But real life isn't like that. Real life is messy, random, and full of things that don't connect. But your brain can't accept that, so it invents connections, creates meanings, and builds narratives that make everything seem like it was meant to happen. Here's a perfect example. You didn't get a job you really wanted. Years later, you say that rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me because it led me to this other opportunity. And that sounds great. It sounds like everything worked out for a reason. But here's the truth. The rejection didn't lead to anything. You happened to find another opportunity later. And now your brain is connecting those two events into a story where one caused the other. But they're not connected. They're just two things that happened at different times. Your brain created the narrative. Or think about relationships. You meet someone. Things don't work out. Later, you tell yourself, I learned so much from that relationship. I grew as a person. It made me ready for my current partner. That's a nice story. But is it true? Or did you just learn things over time, regardless of that relationship? Your brain wants there to be a reason, a purpose, a lesson, so it creates one, even when the reality is just that some things don't work out and you moved on. Narrative bias makes you rewrite your past constantly. You remember events in a way that fits your current story. If you're successful now, you remember your past struggles as character-building challenges that prepared you. If you're unhappy now, you remember your past as a series of mistakes and missed opportunities. But the events themselves didn't change. Only your narrative changed. Your brain is editing your memories to fit the story you're telling yourself today. This creates a huge problem. You start making decisions based on a false narrative. You think, I'm the kind of person who always bounces back from failure, so you take reckless risks. Or you think, bad things always happen to me, so you don't even try. Neither of those narratives is true. They're just stories your brain created by cherry-picking events and ignoring everything that doesn't fit. But you're living your life according to them. Here's another way narrative bias shows up. Explaining other people's behavior. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your brain immediately creates a story. They're a jerk. They're selfish. They don't care about other people. That's a complete narrative based on one action, but you have no idea why they cut you off. Maybe they're rushing to the hospital. Maybe they didn't see you. Maybe they're a new driver who made a mistake. But your brain doesn't care about those possibilities. It wants a simple story with a clear villain, so it creates one. You do this with everyone. Your boss gives you critical feedback. You create a story. They don't like you. They're trying to push you out. They're jealous of your work. But maybe they're just giving you feedback because they think it'll help you improve. Your brain doesn't consider that because it doesn't fit the dramatic narrative it already created. Narrative bias also makes you terrible at predicting the future, because you think your life follows a story arc. You think there's a logical progression. Things happened for a reason before, so they'll happen for a reason again. You think, I'm due for something good, or I'm on a bad streak, as if life is following a script. But it's not. Life is random. Good and bad things happen without any narrative structure, But your brain keeps trying to fit everything into a story, and that makes you see patterns that don't exist. This is why people stay in bad situations. They've created a narrative where this struggle is part of their journey, where the suffering has meaning, where it's all leading somewhere. So they stick with it, because leaving would mean admitting the narrative was wrong, that the suffering was just suffering, not a character-building arc. And that's too painful to accept. So they stay stuck, living according to a false story. Narrative bias also explains why you judge yourself so harshly. You look at your life and create a story about all your failures, all your mistakes, all the ways you didn't live up to expectations. And that story feels true because your brain connected all those events into a coherent narrative. But you're ignoring all the times you succeeded, all the good decisions, all the things that went right. Those don't fit the negative story, so your brain leaves them out. Now you have a completely biased narrative that makes you feel like a failure when you're not. Here's what makes narrative bias so dangerous. It's invisible. You don't feel like you're creating stories. You feel like you're remembering facts. You feel like you're understanding cause and effect. Your brain presents the narrative as truth, and you accept it without question. And once you accept it, you start looking for evidence that confirms it and ignoring evidence that contradicts it. The narrative becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So why does your brain do this? Why is it so obsessed with creating narratives? Because stories help you make sense of the world. They give you a sense of control. If everything happens for a reason, if there's a logical progression, then you can predict what comes next. You can learn from the past. You can find meaning in suffering. That's comforting. The alternative is accepting that most of life is random, that suffering is often meaningless, and that you have less control than you think. That's terrifying. So your brain creates narratives to avoid that terror. But that comfort comes at a cost. You're living according to stories that aren't true. You're making decisions based on false patterns. You're judging yourself and others based on narratives that your brain invented. And you're missing the actual reality of your life because you're too busy living in the story. So how do you fight narrative bias? How do you stop your brain from turning everything into a story? First, question your narratives. When you find yourself thinking, "This happened because of that," or "I'm this kind of person because of this experience," stop and ask if that's actually true. Are you connecting things that aren't really connected? Are you creating meaning where there isn't any? Second, look for what your narrative leaves out. Your brain is selective. It only includes events that fit the story. So actively look for contradictions. Look for events that don't fit. Look for times when your narrative doesn't hold up. That'll help you see how much you're editing reality to fit the story. Third, accept randomness. Not everything has a reason. Not everything connects. Sometimes things just happen. That's uncomfortable, but it's true, and accepting it will free you from trying to force everything into a narrative that does not actually make sense. Fourth, separate events from meaning. Things happen to you. That's reality. The meaning you assign to those events is narrative, and that meaning is optional. You can acknowledge that something happened without creating a whole story about why it happened, or what it means for your future. And finally, be flexible with your story. Your narrative should evolve as you get new information. Don't cling to old stories just because you've been telling them for years. If the story doesn't fit reality anymore, change the story. You're not betraying yourself by updating your narrative. You're just getting closer to truth. Look, narrative bias isn't going away. Your brain is always going to try to create stories. That's just how it works. But you can be aware of it. You can recognize when you're creating a narrative instead of observing reality. And that awareness gives you the power to question those narratives, to see them for what they are, and to stop letting made-up stories control your life. The truth is, your life doesn't have a plot. There's no arc, no theme, no lesson that ties everything together. It's just a series of moments, some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. And that's okay. You don't need a grand narrative to make your life meaningful. You just need to live it. So next time you catch yourself thinking, everything happens for a reason, or this is all part of my journey, remember that's narrative bias talking. And maybe, just maybe, things are happening without any reason at all. And that's not scary. That's just life. If this made you question the story you've been telling yourself, subscribe.